Hello, guys. So, I really wanted to talk about sobriety because I'm really sensing it's something in the collective field that's kind of coming up right now. And I think we've definitely seen a wave of more and more people acknowledging that maybe alcohol, drugs, psychedelics, etc., these things are no longer in resonance for them. And I wanted to share a little bit about my journey with all of this and just some things I'm tuning into, some things I'm picking up on. And so for me, my journey with sobriety has been a long one, and one that I have had to sort of come back to, something I've come back to over and over again. And for me, alcohol was never really a big thing for me. I always felt kind of weird with alcohol, like it didn't really agree with me. Not that it necessarily agrees with anyone, but I was never someone that could drink a lot, and a very small amount I would feel its effects, and it just didn't make me feel good. And so it's funny, even on my birth chart, this sort of birthday analysis that you can get, like for your actual birthday, it says, I remember reading years ago something that said, like, people born on this day, like, just substances in general just don't agree with them. And I have found that to be truer and truer for me as I've continued throughout my life. And it was really drugs for me. It was uppers, downers, whatever I could get my hands on, really. I was an absolute fiend for drugs, like horrendous, like 5-day benders, disappearing, nobody knowing where I was. I couldn't stop. As soon as I started, I couldn't stop. And it wasn't just because I know people go on benders, right? But they maybe don't necessarily have like a serious problem. I think everybody who indulges to some extent, you have to question your relationship with that thing, right? Whatever it is that you're indulging in, whatever it is you use as a form of escapism, it's good to question our relationship with those things. However, for me, I knew there was something different about the way that I consumed compared to my friends and people that I would hang around with, because I could not stop. It was like once it opened for me, that was it. I would literally, until either I literally couldn't get any more drugs, or I just, had no other choice but to call it a day. It would continue for me. And I think I was probably about 13 or 14 when I took my first sort of uppers, and it just continued. And then I had the drug dealer boyfriends. I had all of those kinds of I connected with people who were also involved in that kind of thing. And I talk more about this in my journey. I'm not gonna, in my video titled My Journey and My Journey Part 2, I'm not going to go into the whole stories around all of this stuff, but I ended up in sex work, I ended up in prostitution, and that allowed me to buy insane amounts of drugs, and just that was my lifestyle. That was how I coped, that was how I survived, that was how I just moved through the world, was off my face the vast majority of the time. That was just how I coped. And I had, I think, a number of incidences and just themes throughout my life, just themes of not belonging, themes of growing up mixed race and feeling different and feeling not accepted by anyone, really, and having to sort of try and find myself, and growing up with a single mom, and difficult relationship with her, and also difficulties with my dad, and difficulties at school. I went to 4 different schools. It was just, my life was chaos, and so drugs gave me this sense of like control and stability, and they made me feel normal. And I think there's something around brain chemistry and the way that people are wired differently. When I would take drugs, I would just feel normal. It was like I could come out of my shell. I wasn't as inhibited, but people would always say to me, they'd be like, you just look normal. You don't look like you've taken any drugs. Like, what, I always looked kind of put together whilst I was heavily under the influence, and would be consuming probably 2 to 3 to 4 times more than my friends on any given night out or whatever it was. I was always in the toilet. It was just, it's funny when I look back on it, because I'm just like, girl, you were wild, and it was it was just my way of just coping, and I, was then obviously able to fund those drug habits, and, spent insane amounts of money on drugs, more money than I care to even try and calculate, and lived a very just wild, chaotic lifestyle. And that was till my sort of very early 20s. I think I was about 21 when I stopped prostitution. So I was in there from my late teens till early 20s, give or take. And I, decided, because I was basically on death's door, I was, had a series of just horrific incidents. You can't be involved in sex work without horrendous things happening to you, sexual assaults, rape, etc. It's part and parcel of the business, and we're talking like 12, 13 years ago now. This wasn't the days of OnlyFans. This wasn't any of that kind of stuff going on. It was not pretty. It was not pleasant. And so I had, I think, just experienced enough sexual assaults, and my body just started to shut down, and I couldn't do the job anymore. Like, it literally broke me, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I, had a fair amount of money that I was still just spending on all of these drugs, but I couldn't work anymore. And I reached this point where my family just had an intervention, and I was so thin. I remember my dad hugging me, and I hadn't seen him in ages, and him just hugging me and being like, what the fuck? He was like, you literally feel like you're like a 10-year-old, like, you're so thin. And something kind of started clicking in my brain that if I didn't stop, I was going to die, and that was the very real reality for me. There was no escaping that. It was like, I either stop or I die. And some whisper in my field was telling me that I was worth more, and I was here for more than that lifestyle and just that way of being. And so I started to get back on track and I bought myself a bike, and I would just cycle around the city of Edinburgh, and that was just kind of how I spent my time. And I still smoked weed and things like that, but the hard drugs I was not as involved with. But it was like every so often it would creep back in again, and so it wasn't like my permanent lifestyle, but I would binge. So I would go a while of just smoking weed and, not even really drinking that much alcohol, but maybe sort of having a few drinks socially. But then it's like something would snap in me, and I would go on these crazy binges and benders. And again, it would be like I couldn't stop. It was like the wiring in my brain. It was like the chaos of it all was so, there was something that felt so right about it. And I think that's what's really challenging about addiction and addictive behaviors and patterns, is it feels normal, it feels right. And that's why it's so hard to, even if there's a logical part of you that knows it's not right, knows it's not okay, knows it's doing damage to your body, there's still this part of you that just wants to keep it it going. And so this would happen every so often throughout my 20s and would always intersect with when I was doing really well. So when my poetry career really started to take off and I started to get all these amazing opportunities and, being on these panel discussions at Edinburgh International Festival and all these things, I went to a lot of these events having been up most of the night out my face and just going and just fucking get on with it. And it was like there was this part of me that wanted to self-sabotage and couldn't fully just allow that success to hit me. I got flown to Brazil to perform at this international festival, and it was, amazing, this just incredible festival, all expenses paid, hotel paid for, food, everything, flights. And the week leading up to it had been one of the worst benders of my entire life. My friends and family were just continually trying to get in touch with me. Nobody could get in touch with me. It was horrendous. That was still hands down probably one of the worst benders I've ever been on. And it, then going into this amazing experience, but my neurochemistry is trying to repair itself from having hit it so hard, so I was having all of these amazing experiences, but it's like part of me hadn't caught up yet, and part of me didn't believe that I deserved these experiences. Part of me didn't believe that I deserved good things in life or deserved to have nice things or meet people that were interesting. And I had this total spirit in the corner there. Part of me didn't believe that I was able to receive all this amazingness. And I think that's why it's like this other part of me, we have these different parts that exist within us. There was part of me that was just resistance to it all and didn't feel I could hold it all. It's like, be careful what you wish for, right? Because if you can't hold it, it can create more friction in your field. And I say that, but as well, I know that there was such divine timing within how all of that, everything that was, in terms of poetry and performance, the way that all came in was such perfect divine alignment. It's just that there were still parts of me that needed to heal and parts of me that were catching up, and parts of me that did heal so much through just the sharing of my work and being sort of witnessed and recognized in that way and having all of these amazing experiences. And it wasn't until 2021, so I was still, I would say 2020, I would still find myself on an occasional bender, right? And it wasn't as severe as it had been, but I would still find myself in this sort of, this conflict within myself of like, I just need to go and get fucked up. And there was part of me that couldn't say no and couldn't hold myself back from that. But then I had this huge experience with a friend who had been my rock for so many years, who I'd known for most of my life, who ended up betraying me in this really horrendous way and just wasn't who I thought he was, and just had all of this sort of negative feeling towards me that I kind of knew but I didn't want to admit, and I would shut it out. And it was like this, it was in ways one of the best things that's ever happened to me, because it was such a wake-up call to my lenses of perception and how fucking accurate they are, and how so much of my life had been a process of me trying to dull that down and not face reality and run from my gifts and run from everything that I am as a human being and everything that I'm here to do. I think so often addiction is about not looking at ourselves clearly, and there was part of me that was so afraid of just accepting myself and just being okay with who I am and accepting, like, yeah, I do feel I'm here for more than the mundane life. And instead I ran this sort of opposite way of like, no, I'm just gonna live and thrive in as much chaos as I can possibly create for myself, rather than taking that real responsibility for what I know deep down inside what I'm here to do. And I'd had experiences when I was a little, like, very, very young, of like spirits talking to me, telling me things that I would be doing in the future. And it was like I couldn't see how that would happen, or I couldn't see like that I was here for anything, more than just being a sort of agent of chaos, right? An individual that's just not choosing their highest alignment. For me, it felt like I was just stuck in this sort of rut, and I was living out a lot of ancestral karma, sex work, prostitution runs in my family line. I was very much living out this sort of ancestral programming as much as anything else. And it wasn't until I had that experience with that friend and it just woke me up, and I realized I could keep living this way. I could keep being dishonest with myself, because I think for me, there was something about addiction which allowed me to hide. It allowed me to not take responsibility. It allowed me to keep being in a space of dishonesty with myself and being out of integrity with myself. And because I had seen this person I was so close to display such insane levels of anti-integrity, like literally the antithesis to integrity, it like scared me. It really scared me. And I was like, fuck, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to live so outside of my truth. And so I started to look at all of the different ways where I still wasn't fully honoring the truth that is alive within me. And part of that meant letting go of alcohol, letting go of drugs, letting go of smoking. I'd been a smoker for, at that point, more than half my life. I had smoked cigarettes and I just stopped. I stopped alcohol, and it was so interesting because they just fell away. It wasn't even hard. It was literally like a switch had been flicked. That spirit's still watching me. It was literally like a switch had been flicked in my brain, and all of a sudden it was like I came online and I was like, no, oh no, like I'm not doing this anymore. And I did a 10-day watermelon cleanse. I just out of nowhere just was like, I'm gonna do this watermelon cleanse. And I after that I stopped smoking, didn't ever take any drugs again, never touched a drop of alcohol since. And it's interesting to me too, because I've throughout my life, it's like, okay, I had all of these relapses with drugs, but it was also interspersed with like these intense periods where I would be really into like enemas, colonics, fasting, and like heavy metal detox, and like these really sort of like intense like health practices would intersperse with like benders, so it's this weird juxtaposition. It's like the real me wanted to come out so bad and it would come out through sometimes quite extreme practices related to my health, but then at the same time there was this part of me that just wanted to destroy everything and just wanted to destroy myself, and was so self-sabotaging and so self-destructive that I would have just I could have just kept going on that trajectory. And my mom, people that are close to me, they are so thankful. They're like, there were so many times we thought we were going to lose you, we thought you were at point of no return kind of thing. And I feel like so much of it was just me running from my destiny. And I think I've talked about this before, but when I was about 21, actually, I went and saw this shaman woman who had kind of crossed my path, and she said to me, like, this, basically said to me, this is what you're meant to be doing, and sort of invited me to join this thing that she was running. And I was like, no, like, I can't do it. Like, there's no way. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing the I'm not going down that path. And I did toy with it. There was part of me that was like, I feel like I should, but I think I wasn't ready at that point to really step into that. And it's interesting that it was at that sort of 3/4 of the way towards my Saturn return at the age of 21 that came around, because it was echoing and foreshadowing what would actually happen at my actual Saturn return. So I always say to people when they're about 21, I'm like, pay attention to what happens now, because it's probably a foreshadow to what's coming later. And I really feel that for so many people now, it's like this sort of deeper awareness around alcohol, around drugs, and it not being, obviously there is still such a huge culture around that. I mean, I live in Ireland, for God's sake, like there's a lot of that here, but I do think, and it's the same in Scotland, but I do think there is a continuing kind of awakening around, actually, do I want to put that toxin or that poison in my body, because it has consequences and it has ramifications later down the line as well. And I've noticed this as well with psychedelics too, that a lot of people who, maybe even thought that was their path at one point in terms of, sort of being a medicinal practitioner and things like that, are really being pulled away from that. We really don't need psychedelics in the way that maybe a lot of people think that they need them, especially with the age of Aquarius and just the continual increase of high frequencies on this planet. You don't need psychedelics in order to access those, and sometimes they can actually be detrimental because they open us up too much. I mean, we can open ourselves up too much without any drugs at all, right? Without any psychedelics, without any plant medicine at all, let alone using substances. So I have been seeing that over the last year or so, things really shifting within that space as well. So I think a lot of what we're experiencing now is this sort of recalibration around consumption, around the things that we consume, whether it's food, alcohol, media as well, but really recognizing ourselves as these sacred vessels and the body as temple, and what do we actually want to call into this space, And it's interesting, I did a big clearing with a client recently around alcohol as well, and we actually called for the spirit of alcohol and did our sort of reconciliation with it. And I've done this many times for people with tobacco as well, because tobacco has this sacred kind of spirit that exists. Its essence is this sacred plant spirit, but the way that it's been used has been so bastardized over the years. And so if you have had that sort of discordant, addictive style relationship with tobacco, it can be useful to do that sort of energetic reconciliation with it, to shift those energies within your field, and kind of apologize and ask for forgiveness for the way that you've abused this sacred plant. And it's a really powerful practice. And to then do that with this client around alcohol as well, we could both feel how powerful that spirit is. Like, when we were calling it forward, I was like, whoa, like, that spirit is incredibly powerful. And so thinking about when we invite that into our body, what is it actually doing? And alcohol in its purest form used to be used for exorcisms. It was used to open people up to extract things, and that's what it's used for with tinctures. It's used for extraction, you know, to extract the essence of a plant. And so it can also be used to extract our essence as well. And that is why there's pubs on every freaking corner, you know? So I always say to people, if they are considering sobriety, and if they're asking for my advice around it, right, it's not something obviously we want to force on people, because people have a funny old relationship with alcohol when it's questioned, right? So if that advice is invited, then I always say to people, like, I've never looked back. I have never looked back. And, you know, wanted to, and again, it may be easier for me to say that because my my vice was drugs rather than alcohol, right? But I do think that it's similar. It's using something to make yourself feel better, to numb, to escape, and it has massive ramifications the next day or in the following days, you know? So anytime we're intaking something which is a poison, it's about asking ourselves why. Well, why do we want to bring that into our field? Why do we want to bring that into our body? And most often we'll find that it's because of wounding as opposed to a higher call from our soul. So thank you so much for listening to this video. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to share them. If there's anything you want to share about your own journey with addiction or abstinence or any of the like, I'm all ears. And thank you for watching.